The auctioneer's voice echoed through the dusty livestock barn, but Jeremy Hawkins wasn't listening to the prices anymore. He couldn't afford to bid on anything. His hand rested unconsciously on his left ring finger, turning the gold band that had been there for 12 years, the last valuable thing he owned. In the corner pen, away from the main auction ring, a bay gelding stood with his head low, one back leg cocked at an unnatural angle. Nobody was looking at him. Nobody except Jeremy. "That one's headed to the killers," a voice said beside him. An old livestock hauler named Dutch spat tobacco juice into a styrofoam cup. Shame, really. Used to be somebody's pride and joy, you can tell. But that leg? Ain't no fixin' that. Jeremy watched the horse shift his weight, wincing. The gelding's coat was dull with neglect, ribs showing, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Jeremy's chest tighten. The horse looked at him with an expression Jeremy recognized. He'd seen it in his own mirror every morning for the past 6 months. Defeat. But not quite surrender. "How much are they asking?" Jeremy heard himself say. Dutch laughed, a harsh sound. "For that? They'll take whatever they can get." Kilbuyer offered 300. "That's about 200 more than he's worth for meat, honestly. Horse can barely walk." Jeremy's thumb traced the inside of his wedding band. His wife's voice echoed in his memory. "This ring means you always have something of value, Jeremy. No matter what happens, we have each other." But she was gone now, and the ranch was 90 days from foreclosure. What he was about to do made no sense. He had no business taking on another mouth to feed, especially one that couldn't work. But Jeremy had learned something in his 43 years. Sometimes the things that make no sense are the only things that matter. 6 months ago, Jeremy Hawkins had been a different man. The Hawkins Ranch, 80 acres in the high country of Montana, had been in his family for 3 generations. Nothing fancy, but honest work, running cattle, boarding horses, giving riding lessons to local kids. It was enough, more than enough when his wife Annie was alive. Annie had been the heart of the operation. She had the gift with horses that some people are just born with, could gentle a spooked colt with nothing but patience and a soft voice. The boarding business had been her idea, and it had saved them during the lean years. 20 stalls, usually full, bringing in steady income. Then came the cancer diagnosis. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. Jeremy sold the cattle first, trying to keep up with medical bills, then the equipment. The tractor, the hay baler, the good horse trailer. Annie fought for 18 months, and Jeremy spent every penny he had fighting alongside her. She died on a Tuesday morning in April, with the meadowlarks singing outside the hospital window. After the funeral, Jeremy returned to a ranch that felt like a ghost town. The boarders had left one by one when he couldn't keep up with maintenance. The barn needed repairs he couldn't afford. Fences sagged. The arena footing was so hard you could bounce a quarter off it. He had 2 horses left, his old gelding Smokey, 31 years old and retired, and a young mare named Willow that had been Annie's last project. And he had $60,000 in debt between medical bills and a mortgage he'd taken out against the property in desperation. The bank had sent the foreclosure notice 3 weeks ago, 90 days to come up with $15,000 or lose everything. Jeremy had been driving past the livestock auction that Saturday with no real purpose, just avoiding the empty house. He told himself he was just looking. Maybe he could pick up some tack to resell, make a few dollars, anything to feel like he was doing something instead of just waiting for the end. That's when he saw Elmer. The horse was standing in a pen marked as is, no guarantees, which was auction code for probably dying. He was a bay with a small white star, maybe 15 hands, with the build of a quarter horse. Could have been 8 years old or 18. It was hard to tell under the layer of dirt and defeat, but it was the leg that told the story everyone thought they knew. The right hind hung at an angle that made experienced horsemen wince and walk away. The horse barely put weight on it, and when he did try to move, there was a hitch in his gait that spoke of serious damage. Jeremy climbed over the fence, something you weren't supposed to do, but nobody stopped him. The horse watched him approach, ears forward, which was a good sign. A horse in real pain usually pinned its ears, wanted to be left alone. "Easy, boy," Jeremy murmured, moving slow. He'd handled enough horses to know how to approach one that might be hurting. But when he got close, something unexpected happened. The horse nickered. It was a soft sound, almost conversational. Then the gelding stretched his neck out and blew gently into Jeremy's face. A greeting, the way horses introduce themselves to each other. Despite everything, despite the pain he had to be in, this horse was still trying to be social, still hoping someone might care. Jeremy's throat got tight. He ran his hand down the horse's neck, feeling the prominent vertebrae, the dull coat. "What happened to you, buddy?" "His owner died," a voice said. Jeremy turned to find the auction manager, a weathered woman named Dolores, standing by the fence. "Old fellow, about 90 miles from here. Horse was found in a pasture when the estate lawyer came around. Been alone out there for probably 2 months, best they can figure. Bad leg. Probably kicked by another horse before the owner passed. Infection set in, never got treated." "Where's the kill buyer?" Jeremy asked. Dolores studied him. "You got business with that horse?" "Maybe. How much?" "300 if he walks out today. Otherwise, it will be 400, and I'll give you till Monday to pick him up." She paused. "But Jeremy, you know this horse is—" "I know what he looks like," Jeremy said quietly. He looked back at the gelding, who was watching him with those deep, dark eyes. Patient eyes. The eyes of a horse who'd been waiting for someone to see him as more than broken. Jeremy pulled off his wedding ring. His hands were shaking, but he held it out to Dolores. "This is 14-karat gold, 6 grams, worth about $400, maybe more. I'll trade it for the horse and whatever paperwork you've got on him." Dolores stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "Jeremy, that's your wedding band. I know what it is." His voice was steady now. "My wife would understand. She always said a horse could tell you what kind of person someone is. This horse is still trying to trust people after everything he's been through. That means something." For a long moment, Dolores didn't move. Then she reached out and took the ring. "I'll have the papers ready in an hour. And Jeremy? That horse's name is Elmer. It's on the brand registration. Seemed like you should know." Getting Elmer home was an ordeal. Jeremy had sold his good trailer, so he borrowed a beaten-up 2-horse straight load from a neighbor who owed him a favor. Elmer loaded quietly, trusting, despite the fact that loading into a trailer usually made a horse nervous. He just limped up the ramp and stood there, patient as a saint. The drive back to the ranch gave Jeremy plenty of time to question his sanity. What was he going to do with a horse that couldn't walk, right? He didn't have money for a vet. He didn't have money for feed. He'd just traded the last thing of value he owned for an animal that would probably need to be put down anyway. When they got to the ranch, Jeremy backed the trailer up to the barn and opened the door. Elmer hobbled down the ramp, taking each step carefully. In the late afternoon light, the leg looked even worse, swollen from the hock down, with heat radiating from the inflammation. Jeremy set him up in the largest stall, the one that had been Annie's foaling stall. Deep bedding, a bucket of clean water, and a small amount of hay. He didn't want to overdo it with a horse that had been starved. Elmer immediately went to the water and drank deeply, then turned to the hay. "I don't know what I'm doing, buddy," Jeremy said, leaning against the stall door. "But we're gonna figure it out." Over the next few days, Jeremy fell into a routine. He couldn't afford a vet, but he knew the basics. Cold water therapy. He stood Elmer in the creek that ran through the property, 20 minutes twice a day, letting the cold water reduce inflammation. He hand-walked the gelding, just a few minutes at a time, keeping the leg mobile but not pushing too hard. And he talked to him, just like Annie used to do with the difficult horses. Told him about the ranch, about Annie, about how they were both trying to figure out how to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. Elmer listened. His ears would flick back and forth, tracking Jeremy's voice, and sometimes he'd nicker softly in response. The horse's condition started to improve. He gained a little weight on the senior feed Jeremy splurged on. His coat started to shine, and his eyes brightened. But the leg didn't get better. 2 weeks in, Jeremy was in the stall mucking out, when Elmer suddenly shifted all his weight onto 3 legs, holding the bad leg completely off the ground. The horse's breathing was labored, and sweat broke out on his neck. "Easy, easy," Jeremy murmured, heart pounding. He ran his hands down the leg, and even through his gloves he could feel the heat. The swelling was worse. Whatever was wrong, it was getting worse, not better. That night, Jeremy sat on the porch with a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for an occasion that never seemed to come. The foreclosure deadline was in 60 days. He had no income, no prospects, and now he had a horse that was clearly suffering. The humane thing would be to call someone to put Elmer down. It would cost about $200, money Jeremy didn't have, but he could probably scrape it together. He thought about Annie. About how she never gave up on an animal, no matter how hopeless things looked. She'd spent 6 months with a horse everyone said was untrainable, and that mare had turned into the gentlest lesson horse they ever had. "What do I do, Annie?" he whispered into the dark. The answer came to him not as words, but as a memory. Annie in the barn, working with a horse with a mysterious lameness. She'd said, "Sometimes what looks like an unfixable injury is something else entirely. You have to look past what everyone assumes." Jeremy stood up. He didn't turn on the barn lights, didn't want to startle Elmer. Instead, he grabbed a flashlight and let himself quietly into the stall. Elmer was lying down, which horses with leg pain rarely did. That was the first odd thing. The second was that when Jeremy approached, Elmer didn't scramble to get up like most horses would. He just lifted his head and nickered softly, as if to say, "Oh, it's you. I'm going to check your leg, buddy," Jeremy said quietly. "Just let me look." He ran the flashlight beam down the leg slowly. In the 2 weeks since bringing Elmer home, he'd done this dozens of times, but he'd always been focused on the swelling, the obvious injury. Now he forced himself to look at everything. That's when he saw it. About 6 inches above the coronet band, half hidden in the swelling, was a slight irregularity. Not swelling exactly, more like a bump, a distortion in the shape of the leg. Jeremy had seen something like it before, years ago, on a horse that had gotten a chunk of wood embedded in its leg from crashing through a fence. His heart started racing. He needed to see better, but he didn't want to spook Elmer. Slowly, carefully, he ran his fingers over the area. There, buried under the skin, hidden by the swelling, was something that didn't belong. Jeremy didn't sleep that night. At first light, he was on the phone. He couldn't afford a regular vet, but he remembered that the large animal veterinary college over in Bozeman sometimes took charity cases for teaching purposes. After 20 minutes of navigating phone trees and explaining his situation, he got connected to a 4th-year vet student named Pamela. "Mr. Hawkins, if what you're describing is accurate, your horse may have a foreign body embedded in the leg. That would explain the persistent swelling and inflammation. Can you send me some photos?" Jeremy took a dozen pictures from every angle and texted them over. 10 minutes later, his phone rang. "Mr. Hawkins, I showed these to my supervisor. We'd like to see your horse. This could be a very good teaching case, and if you're willing to let us treat him with students observing, we can do it at no cost to you, but you'd need to get him here." Jeremy looked at his bank account. He had $300 left in the world. How much would a trailer rental cost? "Where are you located?" "About 90 miles south of Bozeman." There was a pause. "Let me make some calls. Give me an hour." 45 minutes later, Pamela called back. "We have a hauler who's coming back empty from a run to Wyoming. He's willing to pick up your horse and bring him here for $200. Can you have him ready by 3 p.m. today?" Jeremy looked out the barn window at Elmer, who was standing in his stall, still favoring the leg but alert and hopeful. "He'll be ready." The hauler was a grizzled old teamster named Roy who took one look at Elmer and shook his head. "Son, I've hauled a lot of horses to the vet school. Most of them don't come home." "You sure about this?" "I'm sure," Jeremy said, though his stomach was churning with doubt. He loaded Elmer carefully, gave him a flake of hay for the trip, and pressed his forehead against the horse's neck for a moment. "You be good, buddy. I'll see you soon." Then he climbed in his truck and followed the trailer to Bozeman. The veterinary hospital was impressive, gleaming and modern, nothing like the ranch vet clinics Jeremy was used to. A team of students met them in the large animal receiving area, along with Pamela and her supervisor, Dr. Yamamoto. Dr. Yamamoto examined Elmer with efficient, practiced movements. "Let's get radiographs first, see what we're dealing with. Mr. Hawkins, you're welcome to wait in the observation area." The next 3 hours were the longest of Jeremy's life. He sat in a small room with a window overlooking the surgical suite, watching through the glass as they prepped Elmer. The horse was sedated, standing in stocks, while they took x-rays from multiple angles. Finally, Dr. Yamamoto came out, and she was smiling. "Mr. Hawkins, you may have just saved this horse's life by being observant. Your horse has a 4-inch piece of metal, looks like part of a wire fence, embedded in the soft tissue of his leg. It's positioned in such a way that it's been causing chronic inflammation but hasn't hit any major blood vessels or tendons. That's remarkable, honestly. Most foreign bodies like this cause catastrophic damage." Jeremy felt like he couldn't breathe. "Can you get it out?" "We can, and we will right now if you give us permission. The surgery is relatively straightforward. We'll make an incision, remove the foreign material, flush the wound, and put him on antibiotics. The prognosis is actually very good. With proper care, this horse should make a full recovery." "How much?" Jeremy asked, even though he already knew he'd find a way no matter what the answer was. "For you?" "Nothing. This is exactly the kind of case we need for our students. You get a healthy horse back, they get invaluable experience. Everyone wins." She paused. "Though I have to ask, how did you know to look for a foreign body? Most people would have assumed the leg was broken or damaged beyond repair." Jeremy smiled for the first time in weeks. "My wife was a horse trainer. She taught me that sometimes what looks impossible is just a problem nobody solved yet." Jeremy watched through the observation window as they performed the surgery on Elmer. Even sedated, the horse stood quietly, trusting these strangers with sharp instruments and bright lights. Pamela was the one who made the incision under Dr. Yamamoto's guidance, her hands steady as she carefully dissected through the layers of tissue. When she pulled out the foreign body with forceps, there was an audible gasp from the students. It was a wicked piece of wire, rusty and bent, with barbs on one end. The kind of thing from an old fence that should have been thrown away decades ago. "This has been in there for months," Dr. Yamamoto said, holding it up to show the students. "You can see how the tissue has tried to encapsulate it." The horse's immune system was fighting a constant battle against infection, which explains the chronic inflammation and pain. They flushed the wound with liters of sterile solution, placed a drain, and stitched him up. The whole procedure took about 90 minutes. When they were done, they let Elmer wake up slowly in a recovery stall, and Jeremy was allowed to sit with him. The horse's eyes were groggy, but when he focused on Jeremy, he nickered, that same soft conversational sound. Jeremy rubbed his face and whispered, "You're gonna be okay, buddy. We both are." The vet school kept Elmer for 5 days, monitoring the incision and making sure there were no complications. They sent Jeremy home with detailed instructions and medications, all provided free of charge. Before he left, Pamela pulled him aside. "Mr. Hawkins, I looked up your horse's brand registration. Did you know Elmer has a pretty interesting history?" "What do you mean?" "His original registration shows he was bred at a ranch called Whispering Pine in eastern Montana. That's a pretty well-known breeding operation. They produce high-quality ranch horses, the kind that sell for $10,000 to $20,000. Elmer's bloodlines include some really impressive working quarter horse stock." Jeremy stared at her. "You're telling me I traded my wedding ring for a $20,000 horse?" She laughed. "Well, his value right now is probably somewhere between free to good home and a few thousand, given his age and history. But once he's healed and trained, yeah, you've got a really nice horse. Makes you wonder why he ended up at a kill-buyer auction. His owner died," Jeremy said quietly. "The estate probably didn't know what they had. Just saw an old horse with a bad leg and wanted him gone. Their loss, your gain." When Jeremy brought Elmer home a week later, the horse loaded into the borrowed trailer without hesitation and unloaded at the ranch with only a slight hitch in his step. The swelling was already going down, and Elmer was putting weight on the leg normally for the first time since Jeremy had met him. Over the next 6 weeks, Jeremy followed the rehabilitation protocol religiously. Hand walking at first, just 10 minutes twice a day, then 15 minutes, then 20. Elmer grew stronger every day. The dull coat transformed into a gleaming, rich bay. The ribs disappeared under healthy muscle. The patient, hopeful look in his eyes changed to something brighter, almost joyful. And Jeremy changed too. He had a purpose again. A reason to get up in the morning, to plan for tomorrow instead of just surviving today. About 8 weeks after the surgery, Jeremy was tacking up Elmer for the first time. Dr. Yamamoto had given the okay for light riding. just walking, no trotting or cantering yet. Jeremy had been working with Elmer from the ground, and the horse was responsive, willing, and clearly trained. When Jeremy settled into the saddle, Elmer stood rock solid, waiting. Jeremy clucked softly, and the horse walked off with a smooth, ground-covering stride that spoke of years of good training. They walked around the arena, and Jeremy marveled at how comfortable Elmer was to ride. Smooth gaits, soft mouth, responsive to the lightest cues. This wasn't just a broke ranch horse. This was a horse with serious training. After 4 weeks of light riding, and getting the all clear from Dr. Yamamoto, Jeremy asked Elmer to move into a trot. The horse obliged with a jog so smooth it felt like floating. Then, Jeremy shifted his weight and applied light leg pressure, giving the cue for a sliding stop. Elmer dropped his hindquarters and slid 15 feet, stopping perfectly square, exactly the way a high-level reining horse would. Jeremy sat there in stunned silence. He asked for a rollback, another reining maneuver, and Elmer executed it perfectly. Spin? Flawless. Back up? Straight as an arrow for 20 feet. Holy hell! Jeremy whispered. What else can you do? He spent the next hour discovering just how trained Elmer was. The horse knew flying lid changes, could do spins in both directions, had a sliding stop that would make a reigning competitor weep with envy. He could work a flag, do rollbacks over a fence, and move a cow with subtle precision. This wasn't a backyard ranch horse. This was an upper-level performance horse, probably trained by someone who really knew what they were doing. That evening, Jeremy called the number on Elmer's brand registration and asked to speak to someone at Whispering Pine Ranch. A woman answered, identifying herself as the ranch manager. "Ma'am, my name is Jeremy Hawkins and I recently acquired a horse that was bred at your facility. Bay gelding, about 12 years old. Registered name Elmer's Finest Hour." There was a sharp intake of breath. "You found Elmer, where?" "At a kill buyer auction about 2 months ago. His previous owner had passed away. And, Mr. Hawkins, that horse was sold 8 years ago to a man named Walter Grimes." Walter was a professional reining horse trainer, one of the best in Montana. We stayed in touch, and he always told us Elmer was the best horse he'd ever trained. When Walter got sick a few years ago, he retired, moved to a small property, and kept Elmer as his personal horse. We heard Walter passed away earlier this year, but we lost track of what happened to Elmer. Jeremy's mind was reeling. "Ma'am, this horse has a full sliding stop, perfect spins, lead changes. That doesn't surprise me at all. Walter showed Elmer at the World Finals in Oklahoma City. They placed third in the Open Division. That horse is worth a small fortune to the right person." She paused. "Mr. Hawkins, why was he at a kill auction?" "Best I can figure, the estate didn't know what they had. The horse had a piece of wire embedded in his leg, was swollen and lame. They probably thought he was crippled and worthless." "And you bought him anyway?" "Traded my wedding ring for him, actually." The woman laughed, a warm sound. "Mr. Hawkins, I think you might have just made the best trade of your life. If you ever want to sell him—" "I don't," Jeremy said firmly. "But thank you for the information." Word spread quickly in the small Montana ranching community. Jeremy Hawkins, the guy who was about to lose his ranch, had somehow ended up with a World Finals reining horse that he'd bought with a wedding ring. The first call came from a woman 2 counties over who'd heard about Elmer. She wanted to know if Jeremy did training. Her young horse had potential, but needed someone with a good hand and patience. Jeremy looked out at his empty barn, at the arena that hadn't been used in months. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." The second call was from a man who wanted to board his 3 horses somewhere they'd get actual attention, not just be parked in a stall. Did Jeremy have space? "I've got space," Jeremy confirmed. By the time the 90-day foreclosure deadline arrived, Jeremy had 6 training horses in the barn, 4 boarders, and a waiting list. He'd started offering lessons again, riding Elmer for demonstrations. People came from all over to see the miracle horse that had been saved from a kill pen. But the real miracle happened when Jeremy sat down with his bank statement and realized he had enough money to make the payment. Not just to delay the foreclosure, to actually start paying down the debt. He walked out to the pasture where Elmer was grazing with Old Smoky and Willow. The bay gelding lifted his head and nickered when he saw Jeremy approaching. "You know what you did, don't you?" Jeremy said, rubbing Elmer's face. "You gave me a reason to keep fighting. You showed me that sometimes what looks broken can heal, that sometimes what looks worthless is actually priceless." Elmer pushed his head against Jeremy's chest, and Jeremy wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, feeling the solid warmth, the strong heartbeat, the proof that both of them had survived. "Annie would have loved you," Jeremy whispered. "She would have known what you were the first time she saw you." That evening, Jeremy stood on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The barn was full. The arena had new footing. The fences were repaired. There was still a long way to go, still a lot of debt to pay off, but for the first time in 18 months, Jeremy felt something he'd almost forgotten. Hope. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Pamela from the vet school. Just checking on how Elmer is doing. We tell his story to all our new students now as an example of why you should never give up on an animal." Jeremy smiled and typed back, "Elmer is perfect. He saved my life as much as I saved his. Thank you for everything." A minute later, "That's what horses do best. They save us in ways we don't see coming." Jeremy looked out at the pasture where Elmer was standing at the fence, watching him. The horse's leg was sound, his body strong, his spirit unbroken. In the fading light, he looked exactly like what he was, a champion. Not because of the titles he'd won or the money he could be worth, but because he'd kept trying when every reason said to give up. Because he'd trusted one more person when trust should have been impossible. Because he'd shown Jeremy that value isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in heart. Jeremy walked down to the fence, and Elmer met him there, man and horse, both saved, both healing, both ready to face whatever came next. Together. 3 years later, the Hawkins Ranch was thriving. Jeremy had 20 horses in training, a full boarding barn, and a lesson program with a waiting list. He'd hired 2 part-time employees and had paid off enough debt that the bank was no longer sending threatening letters. But the most important thing was what he'd built with Elmer. They still rode together every morning, working in the arena or checking fences, just a man and his horse doing the quiet work of a ranch. Elmer was sound, athletic, and as willing as ever. Jeremy had been offered $30,000 for him twice and turned it down both times without hesitation. Some things, he told the would-be buyers, aren't for sale. On the anniversary of the day he'd traded his wedding ring for Elmer, Jeremy did something he'd been planning for months. He went to a jeweler in town and had a new ring made, a simple gold band with an inscription inside, "Found in the broken places." He wore it on his right hand, and when people asked about it, he told them about a horse that taught him what it means to never give up. About how sometimes the things that look the most broken are actually the ones with the most to give. And about how trading away a symbol of his past had somehow given him a future. Elmer stood in the pasture, grazing peacefully in the Montana sunshine, the scar on his leg barely visible beneath his gleaming coat. He lifted his head and looked toward the barn, ears forward, always watching, always waiting for Jeremy. 2 survivors, both scarred, both healed, both proof that sometimes what the world calls worthless is actually priceless. And sometimes the best trades you make aren't the ones that make sense. They're the ones that save your life. If Jeremy's story moved you, we share incredible stories like this one every single day. Stories about horses and the people who refuse to give up on them, who see value where others see nothing, who prove that love and determination can overcome impossible odds. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these amazing journeys. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about hope and second chances today, share this video with them. Thanks so much for watching. And remember, sometimes what looks broken is just waiting for the right person to see its true value. We'll see you in the next story.